Man, look at this headline they chose. Look at this headline Fox chose for this. Ukrainian official Yarmak resigns as corruption probe encircles Zelensky. My goodness. My goodness. Okay. So as we were talking about before we went live, Yarmak has resigned. The origin of this resignation resides in a corruption scandal of about roughly $100 million, more than $100 million, uh, being siphoned off through a kickback scheme through a Ukrainian state energy producer. This was done through former officials, current officials, people working, of course, at the energy company, business partners of Zelensky. Timur Mindich famously fled the country for Israel. That was somebody who worked with Zelensky not only recently, but also as part of his like studio productions when he was a Ukrainian actor and doing his comedy stuff. But so many different officials started getting caught up in this scheme, current, former, and business partners. And Yarmak's house recently got raided by Nabu and Sapu. These are the two biggest anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine that operate with independence. Now, these raids are put in a more blistering context for Yarmak, who is Zelensky's right-hand man and number one advisor, due to the fact that he was the man trying to lead the crusade for these organizations having their independence eliminated. He wasn't the only person who wanted these organizations' independence eliminated. I imagine a lot of the people who are getting caught up in the scheme also wanted their organization's independence eliminated, but they were able to get Zelensky's office to sign on to it, Yarmak leading the way. And it was civil society's protest, even breaking military curfew with signs and protests out on the street saying, hey, no, you are not going to eliminate the independence of this organization. You are not going to sneak this into this legislation. And the office of Zelensky, the office of the president, backed off. So a few months after that, having these organizations where they just tried to eliminate the independence of go after Yarmak, raid his home, and say, hey, look, we got this gigantic corruption scheme of over $100 million. And it's $100 million around infrastructure, specifically infrastructure, not all of it, but a lot of it, enough of it that it's a problem, around infrastructure that hardened Ukraine's energy providers, as in the infrastructure that Russia would strike during an attack if they wanted to knock out the electricity, hardening the infrastructure around that to make it so that if they did strike it, it would have less of a chance of knocking it out because you would have some amount of physical concrete resistance so that maybe instead of one or two drones being enough to take it out, it might have to be 5 or 6 drones, or at least that's the idea. That's the idea and concept. Sometimes you just hit it right and it's only requires one drone. Sometimes you just keep missing and it requires 10 or you're not able to hit it at all. Point is, it was supposed to make it more difficult for the Russians to take out Ukraine's vital energy infrastructure. And for that to be the scandal to hit right now when many Ukrainians are dealing with these outages is I would just say a political catastrophe for Yarmak personally, if he was somebody who ever aspired and had higher ambitions than the essential Ukrainian worm tongue of politics. He is the person that Ukrainians have already not had a good opinion of, who already saw him as corrupt, who thought that he had too much influence in politics. This was something that was reported by the wider press, his amount of influence in politics, domestic press, sometimes international, but mostly domestic press. And most Ukrainians had this conception of him as somebody who, sitting on Zelensky's shoulder, has been a lot of the managers, what has been somebody who's managed the government around him. And so a lot of times the bad decisions in the government get put at his feet. And I think that a lot of it is valid, but also, man, I don't know if people are going to appreciate this comparison. I hear this term often attributed to the Russians of, you know, good czar, bad boyar. The idea that if a bad decision is made, it's, oh my gosh, the czar would never make a decision like that. It's the boyars around him who is advising the czar that has told him and misled him around the truth of the situation. And if he would just know the truth. And a lot of times when you see these videos of soldiers saying like, hey, Mr. Putin, I don't have fresh water on the front line here, and we're being sent in crazy assaults, and we don't have X, Y, and Z, and everything just sucks. Can you please help us out? There's an assumption here, even though of course you're in a situation like that, you're going to do anything you can to help yourself. But there are a lot of times there's an assumption there that It's a lack of knowledge at the top. There's something wrong with the information change. The person at the top, he's well intentioned, he knows what he's doing, he's good. It's somewhere in the chain of command up into where he is that is the problem. And I usually hear the term good czar, bad boyars in reference to the Russians, but I sometimes wonder when I hear people blaming everything on Yarmak, whether there isn't a little bit of this idea also playing out of good czar, bad boyar. Of course, in this case, it would be maybe good hetman, bad bad Cossack. I don't know what it would be here, but I do think that a lot of times Yarmak could have been a shield for Zelensky. And I don't want to say that he didn't give Zelensky baggage, but if something bad happened, a lot of times Yarmak got the blame, or the advisors around Zelensky got the blame. And Zelensky, of course, is going to bring new people in to replace Yarmak. But I do wonder if Yarmak goes down and a lot of these bad decisions continue to be made, or decisions that are not popular continue to be made, whether or not the blame will now shift to the new person who is Zelensky's right hand, or whether the new person who's heading the office of the president, or any of these positions, will the blame simply shift to them, or will the blame shift more to Zelensky? Because, it isn't what it's like at the start of the war when Zelensky had an approval rating that would make, a North Korean official ballot result blush in the percentages he was getting in popularity. Obviously, we're a long way off from that, but we're not in an area where Zelensky's is much further off from Trump's approval rating in the United States, is what I'll put it at. We're talking somewhere from Zelensky of roughly 50%, far way off from the start, but it's also not the worst result on earth. And so he wants to preserve that good image, and I think that he had to cut Yarmak in order to do it at this point with how the corruption scandal is spiraling. But if these decisions are made going forward that are unfavorable, now the blame, I think, will have less likely places to land at the people under him. It will be more likely to land at his feet, as people will say, wait a minute, these types of decisions are still being made. What's the commonality? What's the common factor between administration A, administration B? Of course, I'm assuming a certain amount of recognition of the political ebbs and flows here, but Ukrainian civil society is developed, as we saw from the backlash to the attempted elimination of the independence of the anti-corruption agencies. So I do believe people will pay attention to this. So I think that as this corruption scandal goes on and this gets more attention, obviously the Russians are going to have a field day with this. They're going to say, oh my gosh, Zelensky's right hand, Yarmak, who we've put in all of these different cartoons,
morally
mocking the
corrupt,
administration.
bankrupt
He's
man.
gone down. He's going down, boys. Haha! Can you believe it? These silly Ukrainians and their corruption. There will be factions on the right. I already saw Paula Ann Luna and other people in factions of the MAGA right that is anti-Ukraine. I've seen them running with it, saying, "See, I saw that there was corruption." I saw Victoria Spartz saying, "See, I warned you. I was the genius all along. I warned you." Even though we have yet to have proof that any of this was like aid money from the United States that has been used. As of right now, we know for sure that Ukrainian taxpayers were the ones that were screwed on kickbacks for energy projects domestically, but there was also a lot of aid initiatives in Europe in order to help harden and support Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And we have heard reports in the past of the difficulty of working in certain areas. For example, the hostile military administration area, when it came to certain foreign NGOs and groups, which pushed them to work in other areas. Now, a lot of times they would just work in other areas if they ran into any sort of barrier that would be, would just say, uncouth. But I mean, this is stuff that we heard of before. And while, of course, we're talking about stuff that is structural throughout all of Ukraine, we're not saying stuff that has been preyed upon when it comes to this aid. These types of instances are going to create a specter that's going to make it more difficult in the future for Ukraine to try to get fundraising for its energy infrastructure. And so getting rid of Yarmak, having Nabu and Sapu go out there and actually do these raids and make the country look bad in the immediate term, I think in the long term will help Ukraine not only in trying to rebuild trust and trying to get assistance in the hardening and support of its energy infrastructure, which it's going to have to do, as Russia goes into a brutal air campaign. As December goes on, January, February, March, I expect the missile attacks, I expect the drone attacks to only intensify. And so at this period, Ukraine's going to need a lot of support. And there has been coverage of Ukraine's, weakened energy infrastructure and of the threat that it is under going into the winter. But I feel like some people haven't had it emphasized enough to them that I think it's going to be particularly bad. And so they're going to need that support as Russia essentially tries to grind Ukraine down with American support to it, ever uncertain is really, I guess, the only way you can call it at this point. Ever uncertain. So I think that's one thing that this is good for. I think another thing this is good for is EU accession. If Ukraine wants to join the European Union, I mean, we've seen how quick Albania has just like blown through the process in comparison to like Montenegro or other states, and how fast it's been able to go through the different tiers of accession. Ukraine wants to get into the EU as soon as possible. If the war goes on, if the war freezes, if the war ends, no matter what, the sooner it gets into the European Union, the sooner it integrates, the sooner that EU funds can be made more readily available to it, and the sooner that it has a seat at the table and has a vote at the European Union that can be, not only getting a direct say in affairs, but can also be bargained with as other states come to Ukraine and try to get them to support their initiatives. The better it will be for Ukraine in getting funds to rebuild, the better it will be for Ukraine to getting funds for its defense, the better it will be for Ukraine economically and being integrated with Europe and then giving its goods a market, as it has obviously been cut out of the Russian market and much of its economy has been decimated. And it will make it much easier when it comes to, of course, Ukrainian workers that are now displaced throughout Europe, and having those workers be able to travel back and forth from home, as many of them now have lost their homes to occupation, or have lost their homes to war and destruction, or have lost it due to economic opportunities being destroyed under their feet. So that is another reason why this is good. Another reason why this is good is in addressing the issue of Ukrainian corruption itself. Yermak was a corrupt figure. Yermak was seemingly surprised by this collapse of support around him. That's what reports seem to indicate, is that Yermak was surprised at how quickly everything fell apart. After the raid occurred at his home, he released a statement saying he would fully cooperate and seeming to start to put on a public face. He knows he's unpopular. If you checked out Yermak's social media history before this, he sometimes posts these pictures and statements that seemingly cast him as, the shadowy, wise advisor, the man sitting on Zelensky's mantle, just drumming his fingers together as he ponders the issues and calculates the next move as Zelensky's main advisor. He loves this image of himself, and to the point where he was posting pictures on Twitter of him like half in darkness, shadow blacked out, as he's like sitting back as if he's observing a chessboard trying to calculate his next move. He adored this image of himself. And after 30 years around Zelensky, I think he thought that image was secure. I think he thought that place for him was secure, but it wasn't. And it is better for Ukrainian society. It is better for public trust in society. It is better for, I think, trust internationally. I think that a lot of time Yermak liked to overemphasize how great he was in doing diplomatic efforts. That's not to say that he didn't do diplomatic efforts, but the idea that there was nobody else that could replace him, who not only has less baggage domestically, but has less baggage with many of these countries internationally, as he was often criticized in the United States, I think that might be good. Now, look, I want to split the area of critique. There's two areas of critique here. One area of critique of Yermak was Yermak didn't understand foreign sensibilities, which, in talking to any country, irrespective of whether or not you agree with that sensibility, you need to understand that sensibility, that he was stubborn. But that leads us to our second category, which is Yermak would stand on Ukraine's international business. He would stand on issues of national security, security guarantees, territorial sovereignty, their right to their own energy plant when we talk about the ZNPP, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. or any of the other issues, whether it comes to the elimination of the requirement of exemptions for everybody that committed war crimes, as it seemed as a get out of jail free card for everybody who hunted humans in Kherson, or killed civilians in Bakhmut or any of these other locations. If he stands on that, he's going to get negative reaction from, Army Secretary Driscoll. He's going to get negative reaction from JD Vance. He's going to get negative reaction from Steve Witkoff. He's going to get negative reaction from Tulsi Gabbard. He's going to get negative reaction from those in the inner circle who believe that it's time for Zelensky to tap out. It's time for the Ukrainians to tap out. It's better that the Ukrainians get stiffed at the end and we end this sooner than this to drag on, but possibly we get a better deal for the Ukrainians, or we get a more secure deal for the Ukrainians, or both, as both of these things are good for the Ukrainians. Or that we might have to actually apply pressure, or even just threaten to apply pressure with some delivery, because now you can't just threaten. You need to prove to the Russians that you can actually do something due to how uncommittal Trump seems when he makes these threats, then backs off these threats, say Ukraine can't win, Ukraine will almost certainly win, so Ukraine won't win again. So I think this is an opportunity for Ukraine. I think it's painful to go through this process. Again, if Zelensky would have been smarter and did this sooner and got rid of his personal attachments for the country, whether or not he was doing this because of their long association, he trusts him, they go long all the way back. Like, if any of these things were the main consideration here, that's just too bad. You're dealing with your country's national survival. You got to do what helps you keep the home front united. And I just will say, lastly, I just want to keep beating this in. The next topic we're going to cover is going to be Donald Trump talking about recognizing Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory. And I think it's a possibility that as the scandal continued to develop, as we already knew that JD Vance was interested in using this corruption scandal to try to push a peace deal, thinking that the weakened domestic position of Zelensky's presidential office could allow them to push them to make peace. I think that it's a possibility, as the scandal continued to develop and more layers came out, that the Trump administration might be considering using this moment to further push. Now, I think that this logic is flawed. I think this logic is flawed fundamentally. The idea that, okay, they're in a corruption scandal, so we can push them to make demands they otherwise wouldn't have. And wow, the corruption scandal continued to develop. Now we can push them to make these territorial demands that otherwise they wouldn't have. But also we can push that we can do that even without their recognition, which is the idea that they might even go forward with recognizing the occupation of territory without Ukraine's say, that they might just do it anyway. Zelensky is in a more difficult position now due to these corruption scandals to agree to something like that than before. It's already going to be very, very difficult for you to get this done due to the fact that demands are being made for Ukraine to give up territory that the Russians currently do not occupy. That the majority of Ukrainians, while they're willing to negotiate, they do not support giving up occupied territory, let alone unoccupied territory. So it's going to be an extremely difficult task. But if he is mobbed up in a corruption scandal that has extended from the date of them trying to remove the independence to now, that seems like the worst time to make major decisions for your own political survival, or even if you wanted to be bleak about it, possibly personal survival. That seems like the worst moment to make decisions that could enrage the wider public when it comes to national dignity, not just a question of people's homes, which is already going to be something that angers people. Not only a danger of when it comes to the coastline and the economic health of the country, and national defense when it comes to if we give up this occupied Donetsk territory and the unoccupied Donetsk territory especially, you're giving up certain defensive positions, which could weaken up other locations, but also a question of national dignity. How people walk and how they feel when they walk down the street. It's going to be much more difficult to make decisions based on that in a position where Zelensky is caught up in a scandal where he's already being brought down in the polling data. It's true. So I think that this logic is fundamentally flawed. Trying to use a moment like this is wrong. And if anything, if they wanted to do something like give Zelensky an opportunity to go out there and agree to a deal like this, it's one thing to want to put pressure on Zelensky to get a deal, which, even though sometimes I disagree with the logic of, I understand it. It's another thing to try to put pressure on Zelensky that makes the tunnel, the avenue by which he could make a deal domestically, since it does have to go through the Ukrainian parliament, it does have to go through the Rada. To do that is insanely counterproductive. Insanely counterproductive. This will not work. If they want to get that type of a deal, they would have to get it done under different circumstances. It's either going to have to be a different deal or a different time. Hopefully a different deal.